Hello everyone, welcome to another Zoning Learning from Abroad event. This time we are in New Zealand and we're kind of testing the limits of the international communication here because we've got a 13-hour time difference. So I think it's about 7 a.m. in the morning for George, who's our speaker this evening. I'm Vicky Payne, I'm a planner and urban designer at URBED in Manchester. And I'm going to be your chair for the evening, so I'll be taking questions and stuff at the end. We got the sort of housekeeping stuff. Yeah, so we're going to be recording the event, just to let you know. And in terms of asking questions, if you want to use the chat function, you can add them in the chat box. I think last time we had a lot of conversations going on in the chat. So if you have a question, if you could put Q or question in the heading, and then that'll help me to pick it out at the end. So I'll just introduce our event partners. So we've got the Academy of Urbanism Young Urbanists. They are a network of students and early career professionals who are passionate about developing their knowledge of good urbanism. We have the Urbanist Platform, which is an organisation that are keen to foster diversity and inclusion in the property, urban planning and architecture industries. And then we have POS Novus, who are part of the Planning Officers Society, and they represent a new generation of voices in public planning. They are both a think tank and a network for public planning. So yeah, this week we have George Weeks, who moved to Auckland from London in 2017 to be a principal urban designer at Auckland Council Design Office. He is responsible for refreshing the Auckland City Centre Masterplan, which is a design-led vision for the heart of the city. He's also contributed to Auckland Council's prize-winning work to develop a business case for walking, and he's helped to shape Auckland's transport, road and streets framework. And he has a lifelong interest in the design of city streets and their impacts on people's health and well-being. So I'll hand over to George, who's going to give a presentation, and then we'll come back at the end for the Q&A, and I will invite people to turn their video and microphones on and ask their questions. Over to you, George, and then we have the awkward bit, which is always sharing the presentation.
Thank you, Vicky, and good morning, everybody, or good evening if you are living in the UK or Europe. Is my screen showing
Yep.
the start sign? Fantastic.
There you go.
Fantastic. Excellent. Good to go. Lovely. So thank you very much for the introduction, Vicky, and everyone. Welcome to my talk on zoning in New Zealand. As per the introduction, I am an urban designer at Auckland Council, and I mainly work on long-term design visions such as the Auckland City Centre Masterplan pictured here. This is a map of Auckland's suburbia with all of its zones marked by different colours. And I'm going to talk about Auckland quite a lot this evening, but I'd like to start with SimCity 2000. And this was by far my favourite computer game when I was growing up. And being British, it was my first introduction to zoning as a system of urban planning. Now, in SimCity and in most real cities, zoning is outcome-based. That is, what are you trying to achieve? But in New Zealand, it's different. Zoning here is effects-based, about, in other words, what happens to others if you zone something. I'll get onto this in a sec, but yeah, here's a bit more about me. Academically, I started out as a social scientist and then became interested in the human habitat, towns and cities. I then dabbled with the mathematics of land use transport modelling, but that didn't last particularly long. And then I returned to shaping cities for people via the Prince of Wales's Foundation for the Built Environment, and 5 years at Transport for London before moving to Auckland in 2017 to do some city shaping here. When I lived in Europe, I enjoyed spending my time organising cycling study tours with the Young Urbanists. And now that I live in Auckland, I enjoy sailing. And that's probably enough about me. For my talk, I'm going to introduce you a bit more to New Zealand. I'll give you a summary of the New Zealand planning system and how it works in Auckland. And this all gives a context to zoning, which is then covered in a fairly chunky section. And I'll finish my talk by talking about the ongoing reforms to planning in New Zealand and what this may mean for zoning in the future. So let me welcome you to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are two main islands, which together are slightly larger than the UK, but with a much lower population density. Our population is only 5 million. The capital is Wellington, which is down at the bottom of the south of the North Island, but by far the largest city where I live is Auckland, which is about 600 kilometers to the north. Of the 5 million New Zealanders, half of them live in the upper North Island, and about half of those live in the top left-hand corner. It really is the most extraordinarily uneven population distribution, or another way to talk about it. Here, each of these colours represents 1/3 of New Zealand's population. About a third of the country lives in Auckland. About a second third lives in most of the rest of the North Island, excluding Wellington. And then everyone else is in Wellington, its surrounding area, and then the entire South Island. So there's a lot of open space in New Zealand. And while the sort of image from tourist brochures is something like this, in reality, the country is even more urbanized than the UK. But this gap between perception of a rural country and the reality of an urban one is reflected in how planning works in New Zealand via the Resource Management Act. New Zealand is quite unique because for about 900 years, everyone who came here had to have come here by sea, including the original Polynesian settlers who became the Māori and European settlers starting in the 17th century. It's quite a new country. Everyone has a connection to the sea in one way or another. And just as the founding document for the United States is the US Constitution, the founding document for New Zealand is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between the British Crown and Māori chiefs in 1840. And despite ostensibly honourable intentions, key differences in translation between English and Maori version have caused significant pain. And just as year zero for planning in the UK is 1947 with the Town and Country Planning Act, in New Zealand, year zero for planning is 1991 with the Resource Management Act, or RMA. And to understand this, we need a bit of history. Here's a photograph of small town New Zealand in the 1960s. And for much of the 20th century, the New Zealand government controlled a lot of the economy. Policies centered on maximizing agricultural exports and supporting full employment. And there were all kinds of price controls and subsidies and such like. Many families had a state house. We had very high tariffs and price controls. The price of milk was set by the government. Imports were very expensive, and despite being a tiny market, we made our own televisions and cars. And there was major investment in industry by the state, particularly energy. And this was all large-scale development in an effort to achieve economic self-sufficiency. But by the late 1970s, New Zealand, like many countries, had high inflation, low productivity, and there was an appetite to do things differently. And like many countries, new ideas about deregulation, competition, free trade became much more mainstream in the 1980s. And so like in America, for example, Ronald Reagan supported monetarism, laissez-faire economics, and Mrs. Thatcher took a similar approach, supporting the invisible hand of the market. And in New Zealand, we had Labour Finance Minister Roger Douglas, who in the 1980s moved fast to shrink the New Zealand state sector and to open up the economy. And in a small country like New Zealand, you can make big changes like this very, very quickly. And New Zealand's sheltered state-controlled economy gave way to a very open, very laissez-faire economy in the late 80s and beyond, with cheap money, fewer regulations, factories were closing, shopping centres were opening. And this was all accepted as proof that the invisible hand of the market would allocate resources more effectively than the government. And this view extended to urban planning reform when the previously existing quite prescriptive Town and Country Planning Act and 77 other pieces of legislation were replaced in 1991 by the Resource Management Act. And this is the key piece of legislation that underpins planning in New Zealand. The Resource Management Act has one specifically defined purpose: to promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources. So we have an act called the Resource Management Act, which is about promoting management of resources. So in this sense, it passes the Ronseal test. The RMA does, in theory, do exactly what it says on the tin. The RMA, uniquely among planning systems globally, I think, is effects-based. It isn't outcome-based. And what this means is that if I, as an applicant, can prove that the effects of my development are unproblematic, then I can go ahead with it. In other words, provided I'm not causing harm to my neighbours, I can be led by the invisible hand of the market. And for isolated primary industry, this can be absolutely fine. And this reflects New Zealand's low population density and historic reliance on primary industry. So far, so good. But the RMA cannot cope when resources, particularly water, are fully allocated, and it can't really cope well with cumulative effects. An environment might cope with one dairy farm, but not 4 dairy farms, or many more dairy farms in the area. Under the RMA, it's very hard for councils to declare a halt to further consents, and water pollution from dairy farming, to give just one example, is a real problem in this country. And in urban areas, the Resource Management Act works quite well for small local consents, but it's inadequate for dealing with wide area, long-term and strategic issues of urban development. And also, the Resource Management Act does not recognise explicitly the positive economic, social, and cultural contribution that high-quality urban design and planning can make. So the RMA has quite a focus on mitigating externalities and allowing people to get on with their own business, as opposed to shaping outcomes. And for better or for worse, it has shaped planning in New Zealand for the past 30 years. So let's move on from the Resource Management Act to zoning. Now, zoning, for those of you encountering it for the first time, is really a Victorian invention to preserve property values, and it preserves property values by separating incompatible land uses. Some of the earliest zoning rules appeared in 19th century German cities to keep slaughterhouses out of residential areas. So in the old world, by which I mean Europe, zoning was about enhancing the existing built fabric, which was dense and mixed use and had been around for a long time. But in the New World, such as in the United States, and in New Zealand, zoning was different. Zoning was a way to create new urban fabric with separation of land uses as the #1 aim. And this really started with upmarket railroad suburbs like Riverside, Illinois, shown here. And Riverside is a very, very beautiful suburb. It was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who had previously designed Central Park in New York. And the Riverside zoning laws were designed to ensure that this new settlement would always be a good place to live. Zoning meant that you wouldn't have some idiot opening a meatworks in the main street. You have a quiet, small town life, but quick rail link to your office in Chicago. And so this was early 20th century, but after World War II, zoning became a key tool for development, including in Auckland, where I live, along with for Auckland is Tamaki Makaurau, which is the place desired by many. And I mean, it's always been a popular place to settle and to live. You have a beautiful climate, beautiful weather. It's where most of New Zealand's population growth is going to be the next decade.
George,
And the statutory
we're
vision. Hello.
we're having a little bit of a connection issue. I just wonder if, like, while you're presenting, maybe you turn off your video, see if that helps.
That is a good idea.
Glitches
Yes.
in the audio.
Oh no, that's not so hot. Where was it getting glitchy?
It only very recently, for me at least. So I think if you carry on without the video, that's probably good.
Okay, certainly. I can deal with that.
Sorry, you're in full flow.
It's quite all right. No, I saw a thing saying my connection was unstable. I know that it's a rubbish connection. Okay, so the Auckland plan is the statutory vision for the whole city until 2050, and it's structured around 6 cross-cutting themes which are listed below, and all of these shape the many outcomes in the Auckland plan. And this is a vision, that 30-year vision. It is statutory and it has legal weight. And the rules for delivering that vision are set out in something called the Auckland Unitary Plan, which you can read online if you like. It actually is quite readable. And the Unitary Plan provides rules for everywhere in Auckland, and it does this by using zoning. This here is the Auckland Council geomap of Auckland's zones. We've had zones of one kind or another since the 1920s. And all land in Auckland, including land in coastal marine areas, has a zone. And the zoning is all based upon the effect that development or activity has on others. All planning authorities in New Zealand use zones. And broadly speaking, large urban councils have more different types of zones than small rural ones. And in each zone, there are rules which specify what types of activities are allowed, what you can build, how high you can build, how far apart the buildings are, how much outdoor space houses have, and so on. In other words, zoning basically governs what you can build and what you can do. And remember that planning in New Zealand is effects-based. So what it often means for zoning is you get more intensive activities surrounded by a bit of a buffer. So, for example, Penrose here, the heavy industry shown in purple is surrounded by light industry before you get to the residential areas, and that forms a bit of a buffer. And it's the same with residential areas. Here is the suburb. It's spelt Avondale, but in New Zealand English it is pronounced Evandale, so I will call it by its proper name. Here's the suburb of Evandale. It is in West Auckland and it has a railway station. And here are the zones that we see in Evandale. Some of them are intended to keep the area the way it is, and some of them are designed to drive changes. And remember that every city in New Zealand develops its own zones. This list is just from the Auckland Unitary Plan, and other district and regional plans will use different systems. So Evandale Town Centre, near the station and the bus routes and so on, this is the most accessible part of Evandale, so therefore it's zoned for business. You've got zoned for town centre business, shown in pink, and that's for commercial activities and civic functions. I mean, this is recognising the fact that a town centre is not just about retail, there's other things there too. And moving away from the town centre with this kind of mauve shading, we have business mixed use. And as per the description, this is intended as a transition between residential and business uses. Evandale is mostly residential, and these are the types of residential zones that we see here. Nearest the town centre, we have a zone of residential, terraced housing and apartment buildings. And this zone is designed to drive changes. It specifies that this is about enabling a greater intensity of development than previously provided. It's mainly to be located around the public transport network. And this enables people to develop buildings of up to 5, 6, or 7 stories, depending on the height controls in your area. And it is intended to really densify the most accessible parts of the city. And remember that zoning is about what you can do, not what the area currently looks like. So this house here is in Wingate Street, shown in the pink, highlighting here. And this is a nice single-story house with a big garden, but it is zoned for terraced housing and apartments. So it's likely that in a few years it would have been replaced by something a bit denser. There's almost certainly going to be flats here or denser houses. And so moving away from the densest residential areas, we have other zones that are designed to drive change, such as this light orange mixed housing urban. And this is also designed to drive densification, but less so. I mean, up to 3 dwellings per site are allowed as permitted development. And so this is, again, you get quite a lot of permitted development set out in zones. And this little sample of text here is only one tiny bit. There's about a 20-page description of each zone of what you can and can't do, what you can and can't build. There's also the mixed housing suburban, which allows, again, for intensification, but keeps the character the same. It only allows 2-story buildings. The previous one allowed 3-story buildings. So as you can see, there's a kind of development gradient from the centre to the edges of the town centre, almost like a transect. And then there's something called the single house zone. And the previous zones were about allowing change, whereas single house zone is designed for keeping things the way they are. And interestingly, you'll see that one of these is right next door to the town centre. The development gradient I mentioned doesn't always apply. The houses are right next to the railway station, but they look like these here and will continue to do so. So to understand this in a bit more detail, let's go from Evandale, let's go in town a bit to Grey Lynn. And Grey Lynn is an early 20th century suburb, and it has local shops and facilities. And as you can see from the Sky Tower in the right of the photo, it is not all that far from Auckland City Centre. So the pink area, this dark pink on the top right of the slide, is Auckland City Centre. So we're not far from the densest urban area in New Zealand, but almost all of Grey Lynn is single house zone. So this isn't a development gradient, it's more like a development cliff. So how do we get to this? Let's zoom in on the town centre. As with Evandale, the pink represents town centre uses, which are surrounded by the quite dense housing zones on the west side, on the left side of the map. But on the east side, it is almost all single house, right next door to the city centre. And the reason for this is that as well as zoning being applied to our city maps, we also have overlays. And for this area, we have the historic, heritage, and special character overlays. Overlays can and do cover multiple zones and effectively override the zoning. They're more powerful. And notations, precincts, and appendices are about achieving outcomes on a smaller scale. And in terms of strength, precincts can overrule almost anything. So just like we heard last month about South Africa, overlays can make zoning very, very complicated, particularly in heritage areas. I suppose a wider point about zoning is that while it applies to all of Auckland, it doesn't cover everything in Auckland. It doesn't contain any design control in how new buildings look. Construction quality and assurance is covered by a completely different set of building regulations. There are 78 local authorities in New Zealand, and each one can develop its own zoning system. The Ministry of the Environment proposes a nationwide menu of zones, but this is still very much pending. And zoning can result in development without infrastructure, as in light industry being developed for big box retail, which I think happened to some extent in the UK in the 80s as well. So Auckland Council does not have the power, nor does it set the rules around the attractiveness of people's homes. And as the city densifies, this is starting to cause problems because most people are okay with density, but they're not okay with ugliness. So in terms of zoning, yeah or nah, its advantages are clarity. It is reasonably clear what you can build. It allows permitted developments based on ill effects or not, as the case may be. And if an area is upzoned to a dense residential, for example, you're clearly invited to build and develop more. The downside of zoning as it's practiced in New Zealand is that it's quite inflexible. The planner has far less discretion than in the UK. It's still based upon the RMA, which isn't particularly good at strategic planning in urban areas. And as far as I know, it doesn't really allow form-based design code. And also planners can only comment on certain things. Again, appearance is out. But the New Zealand planning system is quickly changing, and there's two things I want to cover here. This is the fairly recent new governance guidance on where development capacity should be provided and how councils can be more responsive to development opportunities. And it has a very strong emphasis on intensification and creating functional urban environments. So this has three areas. Well, the first one is about concentrating development in accessible places, helping New Zealanders to build homes in the places they want, close to jobs and community services, public transport, and so on. The second part of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development is about being responsive to new opportunities that will significantly increase development capacity, like converting an old industrial zone near a station into residential. And then the third part of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development is removing car parking minimums, except for accessible car parking places. And this is, I think, number three for me is perhaps the most important. In all seriousness, car parking minimums are probably the most destructive force in urban planning because they tie up huge amounts of land and money in car parking that you cannot use for anything else. Most of the awful suburbs in Auckland are awful because of car parking minimums. And if you're interested in this, I really recommend reading The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. Most of Auckland's nicest suburbs were built on public transport routes long before anybody thought of minimum car parking standards. Now, as we move into 2021, there are more changes, particularly the replacement of the 1991 Resource Management Act. And the big change here is its replacement with three new pieces of legislation and stronger direction around the Treaty of Waitangi. So the first piece stems from the resource management focus of the Resource Management Act, but this time we have a clear process to take environmental limits into account, as opposed to just individual impacts. And also, unlike being effects-based, this is outcome focused, so much more like planning everywhere else in the world. The second piece of legislation is brand new, and this provides a strategic and long-term approach to how we plan for using land. And local authorities will have to make spatial plans, and this is completely new. And it's designed to integrate land use planning with infrastructure and associated funding and investment. And the third piece of legislation supports New Zealand's response to the effects of climate change, including managed coastal retreat. And I mean, to this extent, this is the planning system reflecting its new environment. But I mean, planning systems always reflect the political and economic environment to quite a significant extent. I mean, just as the RMA reflected deep and structural changes to New Zealand's economy in the 1980s, the current reforms reflect ongoing priorities, including climate change, housing affordability, infrastructure investment, and pollution. So it's all very much about producing much denser cities, one plot at a time. So what will this drive to urbanization mean? Will we see New Zealand cities emerge like Japanese cities, which have developed over many, many years based upon intensification of plot-based developments? I mean, the Japanese have shown that a few clear rules about height, boundaries, and shading can be part of a robust zoning system. Extrapolate this significantly and you get Tokyo. And this does lead to a wider discussion of the role of the planning system. I mean, is a planning system to build the most houses, or is it to ensure that humanity remains relevant as a species? Or do we have a planning system to reflect the interests of the best lobbyists? I mean, planning systems have to be able to take a fairly fine line about leading while listening and offering flexibility while also providing steadiness and confidence. And I mean, this is a difficult line to tread, and it's no different in New Zealand to anywhere else in that regard. So I mean, to conclude, I suppose New Zealand's planning system is going through major changes over the next couple of years, and zoning is likely to be a part of it. We've had zoning since 1926. It works, it's well understood, and it indeed has provided the framework for ongoing change. I mean, the pluses and minuses of zoning to some extent do overlap with UK type systems. And I think what's most significant for me is the ability of the underlying legislation to shape positive outcomes. And I'd like to finish with my favorite planning quote from my favorite urbanist. And so I think the question for me as we reform planning in New Zealand is, what can the planning system do to really create cities that, rather than just minimize negative externalities, actually are genuinely able to work for everybody? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I can see we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative again to ask the first of two main questions that I had. One was about the, when you showed the slide at the beginning, there was a component of the policy that was to do with Maori identity and well-being. And we've seen in previous iterations of this series that zoning has been used as a tool to really disenfranchise communities. And I just wondered how recent that addition was to the policy context, whether that is something that's always been part of planning in New Zealand or if it's fairly recent.
It's always been part of planning in New Zealand to some extent, but it's become a lot stronger in the past few years. The I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi, as I mentioned earlier, is the effectively the constitutional founding document of New Zealand, and it sets a firm direction for biculturalism and working as treaty partners. That hasn't always been the case in practice, but it became a lot better after the 1970s and 80s. The Resource Management Act, the 1991 one, I think the wording is something like, you have to consider the Treaty of Waitangi, but under the proposed reforms, it is having to give effect to the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a much, much stronger direction. With regard to what's in the Auckland plan itself, I mean, that was published in 2018. Māori Outcomes, including in there, reflects about a decade of work that was done in the Maori design space to actually understand what it means for Auckland as the world's largest Maori city, what infrastructure is required to support this function. So it's quite deep, it's quite detailed. It's been based upon extensive partnership working, and now it's enshrined on a statutory basis. So I think it's really is in quite a good place for the next few decades.
Okay, so I've had my fun now, so I'll open up to the chat. We've got a question from Samantha Stockley about the Evandale example. Samantha, did you want to turn your mic on and ask your question?
Yeah, so I was just quite curious because you were talking about zoning. So in the peak zones, I used Avondale as an example, that is for retail use only. So do you allow residential within that, for example, on first or second floors, or once they've changed of use from, say, historic use as residential with shops below, do you then not allow them to go back? Is that not something you promote? I'm thinking along the lines of, obviously with COVID, a lot of businesses have closed down. Town centre uses across different parts of the world have actually suffered. Like in the UK, they've suffered quite badly. So we're trying to look at bringing back residential use back into our town centres to create more mixed use environments to help sustain local retail habits?
Okay. The short answer is I don't know. I'm actually browsing my way through the Auckland Unitary Plan now to see if I can quickly get a answer on what you are and aren't allowed to do in town centre zones. I think, yeah, I may have to get back to you on that. No, here we go. Here's zones. I think, I mean, just to go back a bit, I think it's a lot less restricted than it used to be. Auckland City Centre used to be very much known as Auckland CBD. It was all about business. And for I think until the early 90s, it was pretty much illegal to live in Auckland City Centre and illegal to build apartments there. I think that there were about 1,500 people living in Auckland City Centre. Now there's about 40,000. So this does change, and there's much more recognition of the fact that a city centre is more useful than a CBD. So, I mean, as for the town centre in Avondale, let's see what it does do. It talks very much about businesses. It says that, yeah, you can have accommodation in their dwellings and such like, supported residential care dwellings. Yeah, they're permitted. Yeah. So from what I can understand, yes, you are allowed to have living above the shop as part of a town centre zone. I mean, the town centre zone, I think, is fairly inclusive. I mean, it's designed, I think it recognises the fact that town centres are not just for going shopping between 9 and 5. They have other functions too, and living in there is part of it. So yeah, this is all within the unitary plan documents, which there's a 24-page document setting out what you can and can't do and build in a town centre zone. And this is on page 5, an activity table of what you're allowed in it.
We've got a question from Jenna, who is actually one of our presenters for the Canadian event that we did. Jenna, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, George. Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed the bike tour reference and, of course, changing. Yeah, so I think I've kind of maybe changed my question since I typed it, as that's my words. I'm just wondering what flexibility there is when the zoning to allow for that like small scale neighborhood retail, which might kind of relate to the previous person's question. But I guess for some context, in the city I live in, Calgary, we've had a lot of feedback from communities on kind of zoning for the future use, because they refer to it as kind of like upzoning, changing property values, like you're going to shadow my bungalow type stuff. So recently they've created a document called the Guidebook for Great Communities, which is more emphasized on form-based code and allowing a bit more adaptability. But even with that process, because there was such sort of concern and feedback by developers and communities members, it ended up being not that flexible after all by the time it was approved. So yes, I'm just wondering that dynamic of sort of the zoning and the feedback from communities and kind of public engagement elements.
Yeah, I mean, the Auckland Unitary Plan was written in 2016, so just before I moved here. I mean, I think to put it politely, there was lots of intense discussion with local residents. I mean, to go into more detail, I think upzoning, there were people who were very keen to be upzoned because it would make their house more valuable and then they could sell it as a development site, and then others who were very unwilling to be upzoned because, kind of like you were describing in Calgary, you're more likely to have something big being built in your neighborhood that will actually change its character and may affect the value of your property. In relation to the nature of neighborhood shops, I've just zoomed in on my local shop now, which is I live in a area of Auckland that's mainly single house zone, but there is a local shop at the end, and that zoning is, it's a pink zone of some kind. I'm trying to find out what it is describing itself as. Yeah, it's retail of some kind. So I think even down to the individual plot of a newsagent in an urban area, it is zoned for retail. And I think the point I made earlier about people about zoning and upzoning, part of the issue with the way planning works in New Zealand is it's very, very hard to have statutory guidance around how places look. And so for people who live in an area of attractive properties, it's very hard to actually say that new builds need to be attractive too, but it's much more straightforward to establish your area as being a conservation area, and that therefore limits the changes to the existing buildings within. So in that respect, even though people might do significant refurbishments on their houses and such like, it still looks the same from the street, and that's what people really value. So I think I mean, in terms of introducing form-based codes and making them easier to use, I'm really interested in how that can work as part of a zoning system, and just in terms of providing assurance around quality. Because I mean, the example I gave in that newspaper article of the ugly houses being built in the neighborhood, we're going to see a lot of that later on, and most people are not opposed to densification. They see that Auckland is ludicrously expensive to live in, but they don't like houses that are unattractive in their neighborhood, which may be attractive, and you've got relatively little assurance of maintaining that. So that's rather a rambly answer, but I think we've got quite similar issues in Calgary and Auckland.
I've got a couple of questions that I don't know if it's worth combining. So there's one from Lynette and there's one from Michael, which all around the timings of this. And I don't know if Lynette and Michael, maybe Lynette goes first and then Michael follows up with this question. You could ask yours and then you could answer them together. If Lynette's still there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm off mute, but I don't know whether I can start my video or not. So seem to allow me.
So that's good.
I think I was just asking about when the new legislation will come in that you were talking about to replace the RMA.
It's expected to be fully signed off by the end of 2022. There's lots of work on it this year, lots of submissions and such like, but yeah, end of next year we'll have a replacement.
And then
right,
Michael, you were sort of go on, sorry.
That's fine.
Michael was just asking, I guess, like, this is from a UK perspective, like how often this kind of thing is updated. So Michael, I don't know if you wanted to add a bit more to that.
Yeah, it was just that in the UK, obviously we have sort of local plans and they get updated every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how quickly you get them done. And I just wondered, with the zoning, obviously it covering, say, the whole of Auckland, does that get updated in sort of one hit, at a set time, and then everything changes from that date? Or is it very much you can tinker with, say, part of the Auckland area and do that kind of a lot quicker? That makes sense. Yeah,
good question. The way it works in New Zealand is that every planning authority, of which there are 78, which is quite a lot for quite a small country, every planning authority has, whether it's a region or a district, has to make its own plan with its own zones and so on. And the Auckland Unitary Plan was quite a major piece of work because previously Auckland hadn't been just one unitary authority. It had been 4 different cities. There was Auckland City, North Shore, Manukau, and Waitakere. There were these 4 different cities, and there was an Auckland Regional Council, but then they all merged into a unitary authority in 2010. So the unitary plan had to be produced to really effectively merged together 4 sets of visions for Auckland into a coherent and detailed piece of legislation. And the fact that it took about 6 years to write gives an idea of how complicated it was. So I think the unitary plan having been done, people are quite keen to actually get their money's worth and enjoy it. Just because a comprehensive update would be not what's needed. I think what is needed now is more sort of maintenance, keeping it up to date. You can upzone things if you want. People consider that, I believe. But I mean, I think just more generally, I mean, I mentioned that there are 78 planning authorities in New Zealand. One of the recommendations of RMA reform is to reduce this number so you don't have 78 district and regional plans across the country, because they don't always agree with one another and you get funny disparities at regional and district borders. So maybe a smaller number of larger plans might be what has to be developed. So I think in terms of where plans are being developed, I think the Auckland Unitary Plan is staying where it is for now, but other areas might be having more changes over the next few years as RMA reform continues.
Great. We have a couple of questions from Derek, and then I might add in a couple more that I had, unless we have some more questions from the participants. Derek, did you want to ask?
Yep. Hi. Good morning. Good evening. Yeah, I'm really interested in the design agenda and who leads that in New Zealand. Is that led by architects or planners? And I know you said about the difficulty of getting good design, but I'm wondering, looking ahead, where do you see the response to that design agenda? I mean, it looks as if there's some interesting buildings happening in New Zealand, and we all know there's some really good architects there. And I'm going to link my other question to it, because it's also part of the fascination I have, which is I was in a beautiful house in New Zealand, which apparently, although it was on a new plot, was actually quite old. And the person who owned it had moved it twice from one plot to another, which, you know, in Britain is utterly unbelievable. I'm wondering how all that fits together, and I'd be really interested to hear your answer.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Yeah, literally moving house is quite a common thing here. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. New Zealand traditional houses were much more likely to be made of wood than they were in the UK. And traditionally, New Zealand houses were made out of a wood called kauri wood. Kauri wood is very light, very hard, doesn't rot, comes in huge sizes. It's why there aren't many kauri trees left, because they were so popular with timber merchants. But so if your house is made of kauri, firstly, the timber is valuable. Secondly, it is reasonably light, and it is not that difficult to cut it up and move it. I mean, house moving is quite a big business here. It's a pretty brutal business. You basically cut the house in half with an enormous chainsaw, stick it on the back of a lorry and drive to wherever you want to place it. But you do see it quite a lot. And particularly in Auckland, where you've got upzoning taking place, you may have a house that is of architectural merit and value, and people love the idea of an old villa, but the land that it's on in Auckland is too valuable. But there are plenty of other towns in New Zealand where it would be a much more realistic proposition. So that is quite common. It's one of the things I do quite like, the fact that people do recycle interesting old houses. So that's your first question. Sorry, that's your second question. Your first question was about the design agenda. I think to a significant extent, it's led by the architecture profession. Some of the most interesting developments that we've seen in New Zealand, such as co-housing, plot-based development, a lot of these have been led by individual architects working with developers to say, here's a new idea, let's try this out and see if it has legs. I mean, to some extent, the design agenda is shaped by when you get successful partnerships between the public and private sector. The Auckland City Centre Masterplan, I mean, I worked on the 2020 version, but the original version was published in 2012. And that set out this quite bold, quite exciting vision of Auckland City Centre with City Rail Link, imagine Crossrail for Auckland, bringing more people to the city centre, exciting new public spaces and so on. And this, I think, was inspirational to some of the major developers in Auckland. There's a company called Precinct Properties who are on record as saying that the City Centre Masterplan was instrumental to our own planning and investment. And they've recently developed a major new downtown retail space and a 40-story office block. I mean, that's about $1 billion of their investors' money. And you don't do that unless you've got a pretty high level of confidence about the agreed vision for your area. So that's when it works well. But I mean, what we do lack in New Zealand, and I think is a real issue, we don't have a CABE or a design council or anyone like that to really champion good design at a national level and to coordinate the different industries, to coordinate national government and local government. I think that's something that we really are lacking. And I mean, I know people that are involved with trying to set something up, and I think that would be a really, really helpful piece of progress. If we can make that over the next couple of years, I'd really support it.
Thank you. That's really good. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Thanks. I had a question about, when I was doing your introduction, I was talking about the fact that you were interested in walking specifically and making connections, and like in the previous presentations that we've seen, zoning is very plot or block based and doesn't say much about the connections in between. So I wondered about what maybe it's the new piece of policy that's looking more at strategic spatial planning that sort of bridges those gaps, but what's been your experience so far of making those connections in the New Zealand context?
I think street design in New Zealand, like many countries, suffered greatly after World War II because of the rise of highways engineering. And I mean, if you're trying to, I mean, those aerial, I showed in my slide pack the aerial photograph of the 1920s suburb, and those of in Auckland, and those are very much designed around tram lines that ran from the city centre to suburbia. The tram lines ran more or less north-south, and most of the residential streets run east-west. And the design of the street grid there was very much set up to bring as many people as possible from the transport network to the local centres and then on into their houses by foot as easily as possible. If you're solving a street grid to maximize outcomes for moving general traffic, you wind up with a completely different street outcome. You get cul-de-sacs and sweeping curves and free left turns and such like. And New Zealand, I think to a large extent, using Australian guidance, went rather overboard for that for quite some time, and that has left a pretty some parts of outer Auckland are non-walkable due to over-enthusiastic use of out-of-town highways planning manuals. So we have new guidance by Auckland Transport, which specifically specifies how street grids should work to be walkable and specifies walkability, particularly around public transport. So that is out there, but it was only published in 2020. So, I mean, yeah, the second best time to plant a tree is now. The first best time is 40 years ago. And I think it's the same with highway street guidance. The main challenge now will be ensuring that kind of guidance is applied nationally and rigorously. And I think the best hook for that is Vision Zero. Auckland Transport is a Vision Zero organisation, others are too. And I mean, Vision Zero, when it's done well, is really about removing the obstacles. Removing the obstacles in systems that get in the way of road safety. And a hugely important part of that is about designing streets that are pedestrian focused. We have the guidance for that. And I'm hoping, let's see what happens, that Vision Zero will provide a good, strong lever to say, if you're developing area, if you're doing your zoning, don't just look at what the plots do, look at your street network as well and think about how it actually facilitates connections and general accessibility.
Because I was thinking you're kind of uniquely placed in apart from some of the presentations that we've had previously. I think Jenna had UK and Canadian experience, but you obviously worked for TfL, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the differences that you experienced, maybe in the context of public transport and walking and cycling, but any other sort of differences that you've noticed moving from one context to another.
Sure. I mean, I think what's interesting is that there are a lot of similarities. I mean, New Zealand, of course, a large number of people in this country came from the UK. The planning system, the legal system, they started off in fairly similar directions. So I mean, it's more similar than you might imagine. I think the difference is that New Zealand, being very much a country that was settled. I mean, like my slide earlier with the boats, everybody here, whether you were coming from Polynesia or Scotland or South Africa, everyone's come here from somewhere else over the past millennium or so. So a large amount of how people think about planning is very much, I've come here, I've got my place, be it my individual plot or my family's land, and it's very much, it's, yeah, we are on it, we should develop it as is required for our needs. You don't have the millennia of human settlement that you have in Europe or almost anywhere. So that makes things quite interesting. So I think compared to London, London, you've got thousands and thousands of years worth of title and ownership and plans and such like. You can go back a hell of a long way in quite some detail. You do not have the same here. It's a much newer country. I think in relation to TfL, I mean, Transport for London was a wonderful place to work because I think it's the UK's only integrated transport authority. The only real spatial plan in England and Wales is the London plan. And so you got really quite good integration between land use and transport. I mean, this is the place that had introduced congestion charging in the UK, introduced contactless payment for public transport with Oyster, I mean, it was the first place to really do cycleway design well in the UK was London, again under TfL. So that was it was a fascinating place to work. What's interesting about Auckland is because it's a unitary authority in a smaller country, if there's pressure for change can happen a lot more quickly than in London. I mean, and that's good so long as there is pressure for change in the right direction. I mean, Auckland, I think, in about 7 or 8 years, it electrified its rail network. It brought in contactless payment. It brought in integrated ticketing. So again, like the way that Oyster works in London, your ticket, your same card, works for the bus and for the train and everything, and it's capped. It rearranged its bus network to be much more connected. I mean, New Zealand had bus deregulation like the UK in the 90s when it was trying to be very free market. New Zealand realized that bus deregulation is a really daft idea and they brought it back in again. You can move quite quickly with public policy changes, much more so than in the UK, and certainly I suspect more than in America. So that it very much depends on the external forces involved. If you don't have a force for change, nothing will happen. But if it does exist, then change can happen quite quickly, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. Okay, well, I think we're kind of out of time. So I'll just thank you for joining us from so far away, and thank you to everyone for attending the session and for your questions. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Pleasure to meet everyone. And I hope that you can all come to New Zealand at some point. Or too long.
Hope so. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
George.
Thanks, George. It was really interesting. And Vicky, great chairing as usual.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
I'll see you guys soon. Bye.
Bye.